And please do remember to select the channel you're going to be recording. So if it's, let's say, English, stay on the English channel, French, the same.
Do you want our cameras off until we're taking the floor, or cameras on for the sort of till we're done speaking and then gone?
It's a good housekeeping rule to, if you're not taking the floor, to turn off camera and the microphone until it's your turn. So you turn off. So thank you for that.
So Eleonora, probably in about a minute, we'll let everyone in from the waiting room. You can wait another minute or so, because it always takes a couple of minutes for people to come in. And then you can just go ahead and start. And just obviously, remind people they'll need to choose their language, even though we'll be getting to the French a little bit later.
I'll go through the housekeeping as well, yeah.
Great, okay. All right.
When you wish, Leila, you can let everybody in.
Okay, great. All right, so I'm going to let them in, Leonora, but I think you just wait maybe a minute or two. Great.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm pleased to welcome you to this webinar on crisis-sensitive planning in emergency and displacement situation, which builds on the guidance note on developing a crisis-sensitive teacher policy, which was jointly developed by UNESCO, UNHCR, ILO, and UNICEF in 2020 under the Norwegian Teacher Initiative. During this webinar, we're going to highlight some of the key provisions that are needed to ensure that a teacher policy is also a crisis-sensitive policy, advocating for teacher support in emergencies and understanding how teachers, what role they play, and sharing lessons learned from a wealth of experiences. The webinar is a launch of the consultation process on a new module, which we're working together to develop, that looks at how crisis-sensitive teacher policy will complement the teacher policy guide that was developed by the International Task Force on Teachers for Education 2030. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping rules, if I may. Panelists are invited to keep their camera on and their microphone off when they're not speaking. Participants are invited to please mute your microphones when you're not speaking. But if you would like to speak, take the floor, please do feel free to put your video and microphone on. Of course, microphone is essential or else we won't hear you. Audience colleagues, you're invited to use the chat feature. Please don't hesitate as the presentations and the discussion is ongoing. Please feel free to use the chat feature. And also note that English and French interpretation is available by selecting the little globe icon at the bottom of your screen. So with that being said, I would like to welcome all of the speakers that are with us today. We have quite a wealth of experience and a wide range of representation. First and foremost, we have Ms. Gerd Hanne Fossen, who is the Education Policy Director from Norway's NORAD, and she's also the co-chair of the International Task Force on Teachers for Education 2030. We also have Mr. Carlos Vargas Tamez, who is the Chief of the Teacher Development Section at UNESCO and is the head of the TTF Secretariat. Also with us today is Ms. Constance Alezuyo. She's the coordinator of the Education Response Plan, Secretariat for Refugees and Host Communities from the Ministry of Education and Sports in Uganda. We will also have with us Ms. Angeline Neya-Donbois, who's the Technical Secretary for Education in Emergency Situations with the Ministry of Education, Literacy, and Promotion of National Languages in Burkina Faso. And also with us today are two teachers, Ms. Stella Turehe, who is a national teacher working in a refugee settlement in Uganda. And we also have Ms. Grace with us, who's an internally displaced teacher from Burkina Faso. So my name is Lenore McEwen. I lead UNESCO IAP's work on crisis-sensitive planning. And IAP, if you don't know, works with ministries to strengthen capacities for educational planning and management and strives to ensure that all educational planning is crisis sensitive. This means understanding how risks of conflict and natural hazards impact education systems and identifying strategies to be put in place so that education systems can reduce these impacts and ensure the continuity of quality education in even the most dire circumstances. And we all know that teachers are the central actors when it comes to providing and preserving education, and that they play a key role in modeling behaviors that foster social cohesion and in teaching learners safety. However, teachers themselves are also confronted with challenges, and many may have uncertain career opportunities. They may have to manage financial and social insecurities. There may be recruitment or deployment policies that affect when and where they work and that are perhaps unequitable. And they may have limited opportunities for professional development or teacher supervision. And these challenges are often exacerbated, right, in crisis settings. In 2017, IIP and Education Development Trust launched a research program to contribute to the evidence base on teacher management in refugee settings and to highlight the challenges, but also to focus on the promising policies and practices that are in place in refugee settings in Ethiopia, Jordan, Kenya, and Uganda. And this work has fed into the guidance that we'll be discussing here today. And IIP is very, very grateful to have had the opportunity to work with the TTF, the NTI, and UNHCR to support the development of this note. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the floor over to Ms. Gerd Hanne Fossen. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Leonora, and thank you so much to the organizers for organizing this webinar, and even more so for all the work that's gone before this webinar on the crisis-sensitive teacher policy module to accompany the teacher policy development guide. So I've been invited to give a short background on the Norwegian Teacher Initiative. So I'll just do that quickly to provide a little bit of a setting within which this work has taken place. And then all the honor goes to the people that have done all the hard work, and not at all to NORAD. So the Norwegian government placed very high priority on education in the early 2013-14 with the new government that came into place at that point. And quality was placed high also on the agenda. And teachers as a key in-school factor impacting quality of education, student thriving and student learning was something we wanted to do more on. At that point, we also had more information about teacher shortage, the projections of the millions of teachers needed to reach the SDG 4 targets of quality education for all. And we had SDG 4C on teachers centrally placed on the global education agenda. But we had also seen that policies related to teacher issues were not always comprehensive. Sometimes there were bits and pieces developed, and there was a need for more comprehensive policies. Furthermore, teacher representatives and teacher unions were often not consulted when developing new policies, and there was a need, we had heard from partners, for more consultative and inclusive processes. And since Norway's aid to education is designed such that we primarily support global partners and work through and with our global partners, and we have few bilateral programs, it was natural for us, when we wanted to do more in this area, to turn to some of these large multilateral partners in education and Education International. So in 2015, upon consultations with these partners, our Prime Minister launched a teacher initiative under a summit that was held in Oslo that same year. After that, UNESCO, UNICEF, ILO, GPE, UNHCR, the World Bank, and Education International, in dialogue with NORAD, crafted what now goes under the term or the name, the Norwegian Teacher Initiative. There are two components in the Teacher Initiative. One was strengthening the coordination among partner organizations at the global level. This was because these partners had been telling us that there wasn't that much capacity in the organizations at that time to really work specifically on teachers, although teacher issues were often included in their programs. So we wanted to help facilitate more collaboration between partners, again, upon them telling us that that was something they felt was needed. Also, collaboration then among these partners in some specific countries to see how they could work together to support countries, developing countries, in their work on crafting more comprehensive education teacher policies was part of the second strand. So the global collaboration in general on teachers, and then specifically for countries developing policies more comprehensively and consultatively on teachers. And the 4 countries that were selected were Burkina Faso, Ghana, Malawi, and Uganda. The development of comprehensive teacher policies has been led by countries, but with the support of some of these organizations, depending on the country. And it has also included teacher unions for input and for the ownership of teachers, because teachers are often the ones who actually implement teacher policies all the way down in the classroom. And then, of course, also in consultation with the donor community. This has taken on different forms in the 4 countries, and different products have been developed. But all countries at this point report progress, along, of course, with some challenges, as there always will be, and additional challenges due to COVID-19. The perspective has been that policy should be relevant both in the long-term development perspective, but also be crisis sensitive. So UNHCR's role, particularly in this collaboration and initiative, has been that focus on refugees, and other partners also, of course, are working in both the long-term and the crisis settings. And today's webinar focuses particularly on the aspect of creating policies that are crisis sensitive. If anyone would be interested in more information on the Teacher Initiative as such, please reach out and we'd be happy to share more information. I'm very much looking forward to hearing more about the new module on crisis-sensitive teacher policies that will be accompanying the Teacher Policy Development Guide developed by the Teacher Task Force. And I'm very, very pleased that this is a piece that's sort of been facilitated within the Norwegian Teacher Initiative. Thank you very much, and looking forward to the rest of the webinar.
Great. Thank you very much, Gerd Hanne, and thank you very much to the Norwegian Teacher Initiative indeed for framing this work. So we're going to now delve into the depth of the subject, and I'm going to turn over to Carlos Vargas Tames to hear about this new crisis-sensitive teacher policy development. So over to you, Carlos.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Leonora, and thank you also, Gerd Hanne, for your introduction as to the work of the Norwegian Teachers Initiative that has made possible a development of further guidance for something that we are seeing is more common today, unfortunately, than it has been in the past year, which is the issue of crisis, be it by means of natural change and climate change, natural phenomena, be it by armed conflict, be it by sanitary and biological situations like we see today with the COVID-19. So I think it is very timely to do further thinking and to draw on very important work that has been developed by the different partners that join us today. So thank you for that introduction, and thank you also to NORAD for their support in the development of this guide and throughout the Norwegian Teacher Initiative, whose examples we'll hear in the voice of the actors at the national level later on. So thank you and welcome everybody. As my colleague has already announced, I'm pleased to present to you today the joint new module on crisis-sensitive policy development, which, as has been mentioned, was developed or is being developed within the NTI and with the UNESCO Institute for Educational Planning. Maybe if we can share the presentation, Maram, if you can possibly. Thank you very much. It is charging there. I think there we can all see. Good. So what I was saying is that this module is based on evidence from the field, so the experiences from multiple organizations, of course, the IIEP and UNESCO, the NTI initiative, the UNHCR, and their partners in crisis-sensitive planning, and it provides guidance in key dimensions of teacher management. Today marks the launch of a consultation process in which we hope that the key partners present today and beyond will take the opportunity to comment and to provide feedback and examples to enrich the module. My colleagues will, throughout the session, be sharing with you the links where this is possible. And when it is finalized, it will become an addendum to the Teacher Policy Development Guide. I will come back to it in a moment, but let's start with the content. So Maram, let's look at the next slide, please. So why do we need a crisis-sensitive teacher policy? Well, first of all, we think it is important for a number of reasons, which can actually advocate for all teacher policies to apply a crisis lens. So as we've said, it's become more common and more often that educational disruptions are happening throughout, and also the precariousness and the scarcity of resources worldwide is making these approaches more and more relevant. The prevalence of crisis, of disasters worldwide that we have seen threaten education continuity and education quality, which results in a growing number of forcibly displaced people around the world, people taking refuge, having to move even within internal borders. At the end of 2020, just to share a figure with you, 82 million, more than 82 million people were forcibly displaced due to persecution, violent conflict, human rights violations, natural disasters, and events that seriously disrupted the public order, within that, of course, education. An estimated 35 million are children. In addition to threatening education continuity, these crises often magnify existing challenges and inequalities. Now, this goes hand in hand with the fact that education systems are not always prepared to respond to the crisis when they arise. Plans to prepare for, to respond to, and to recover from crises are lacking in many countries. This flow in educational planning compounds already chaotic situations, leaving frontline actors with very limited guidance. School leaders and teachers become then essential in overcoming crisis-induced consequences on education. We have recently seen the COVID-19 situation as a very important example of how education systems are not prepared to address crisis and disruption. And not to forget are the multiple harmful effects of crisis on children and youth, not only regarding physical safety and health, but also on their emotional and mental well-being, especially on forcibly displaced children. Of course, this has an impact on their learning outcomes. Such situations create specific educational and psychosocial needs that teachers will have to respond to. And it is in this context that teachers who are well prepared may act as critical agents to support, to protect the affected children and their learning, and bringing them a sense of safety, of normalcy. Their support to affected learners is therefore essential, but this can only happen if they have the appropriate training, support that they need in terms of psychosocial well-being, but also material and financial support that teachers need to be equipped to them in turn support learners in their learning and in their well-being processes. If we look at the next slide, we can see how crises impact teachers and teachers management. As we have mentioned, teachers and other education personnel are essential for ensuring education continuity, quality, and equity in crisis situations. They are affected in several ways, one of which has to do with the impact that different crises have on absenteeism, the high turnover of teachers, and ultimately in teacher shortages. The teaching workforce may shrink either because teachers have fled for safety reasons or have been killed, injured, or displaced. Retaining teachers in unsafe environments might become a pressing issue as well. They may lack access to school due to several reasons, such as security within the school or between the homes and school, the disruption, of course, of salary payments that we have seen, illness and trauma, or even recruitment into the military. This may lead to high absenteeism and turnover, making the situation harsher. Therefore, the job security, the well-being, the safety of teachers needs to be protected in times of crisis. In these times, teachers may be confronted with financial insecurity because national payment systems may break down and education budgets may plummet. In case of displacement, it may be difficult and it will be challenging for the government to pay teachers outside of their districts to track the movement of teachers within and, of course, across countries. At the same time, refugee hosting countries may not have sufficient resources to compensate for newly hired teachers. This loss of compensation and benefits place teachers in economic distress. Additionally, teachers need psychosocial support in the same way that affected learners do. When unmet financial, socio-emotional, and physical needs may hinder teachers' ability to respond to learners' educational and non-educational needs. And finally, there is, of course, the issue of teacher quality. The lowering of the quality is an impact of the crisis as well, as teachers suddenly become confronted with overcrowded classrooms, of course, with a diversity of learners with very heterogeneous characteristics in terms of language, culture, origin, grade, learning, psychosocial needs, and so on. So they may have to deal with damaged facilities as well, lack of educational material, unsafe environments, etc. So they would need to adapt their teaching and their teaching practices to these emerging challenges very quickly. Ministries may also struggle to attract qualified teachers, at times creating a heavy reliance on volunteers and community teachers with little or training or with inadequate qualifications. Furthermore, access to both pre and in-service teacher professional development may be disrupted during the crisis. Therefore, it is essential to apply a crisis-sensitive lens in the development of national teacher policies in order to anticipate and address challenges with identifying key actions that teachers can take to make school areas of peace, safety, and learning, and providing the necessary support. In many situations, as we have seen in times of crisis, but in times of precarity as well, we have seen how schools and teacher action become the haven from persecution, the haven from hunger, the haven from violence outside the schools. Such a lens, though, requires the inclusion of key provisions to dimensions of teacher management that are necessary for the prevention and mitigation of and recovery from conflict and disaster. The next slide will show what you already might be familiar with, which are not that, but the previous one, which shows the 9 dimensions of the teacher policy development guide. And see if my colleagues can get to the presentation and to the slide in place. But just to remind you that we launched a teacher policy development guide at the end of 2019, which has 9 dimensions that cover from teacher recruitment to professional development to career opportunities and so on. So the idea, as you can see, the dimensions are on the screen. The idea is to focus on some of these dimensions in order to address how policies can be more responsive to crisis. So if we go to the next slide, please, I will show you the key policy areas. If we go to the next slide, Maram, thank you. So the key policy areas that we have focused on, which basically is based on the research that we have reviewed that has established a set of factors that directly impact the motivation, well-being, and quality of teachers. Now, these factors pertain to, among others, the quality of initial and in-service training, qualifications, employment and working conditions, and of course, participation in decisions that affect both the teaching trade but learning overall. So these 4 areas that you have on the screen will be built on as relevant dimensions from the teacher policy development guide. Now, the next slide will show you the structure that we are suggesting for the module. For each of these 4 areas that were presented in the last slide, the main challenges that may arise as a result of crisis are identified in the module as a set of main objectives to be pursued, either to prevent or to respond to the crisis. And this is what we are proposing. Each area provides a list of suggested strategies that actors from all levels, central, local, even the school level, may consider to prepare for and to respond in times of crisis. Finally, each section will include examples, text boxes, vignettes, which describe a real-world example of promising policy and practices related to teacher management and the implication of that example for the development and the implementation of crisis-sensitive teacher policies. The next slide will recollect briefly what are some of the main challenges that we have summarized on this slide. 4 major challenges for teachers in crisis situations that need to be considered when developing crisis-sensitive teacher policies. So as you can see, and just in case the print is a bit small in your screen, the first one refers to recruitment, deployment, and retention. And issues included under this area have to do with teacher shortages, particularly the shortage of qualified teachers, the precarious contractual arrangements, the casualization, the precarization of the teaching profession, absenteeism and turnover, the exacerbated gender gap in recruitment, which is something very important, and the lack of access to quality data to actually support teacher deployment. The second challenge that we will address has to do with working conditions, employment, and well-being. So there we see some of the elements that this includes. As we have mentioned, on the one hand, the emotional and psychological and physical well-being of teachers. This includes, of course, the working conditions and to what extent this might impose constraining situations for teachers as well. This also includes compensation schemes, remuneration, and the support that teachers may have from peers, school leaders, and supervisors in times of disruption, which is very, very challenging. The third element is initial and ongoing teacher education. So here we analyze the threats to the continuity and the quality of teacher training provision, particularly the lack of training in non-traditional topics, methods, settings, formats, and of course, the psychosocial support that teachers need. And finally, information sharing and consultation mechanisms that we see that are very, very important. In some contexts, there is a very low level of consultation of teachers in decision-making processes, and this even worsens when it comes to crisis contexts, as we have seen, for example, with the COVID-19. There's also the issue of exacerbated information and communication gaps that need to be dealt with. Now, these multiple and complex challenges highlight the importance of developing crisis-sensitive teacher policies to ensure quality education and to support learning in crisis situations. And the next slide, and my last, so just to share with you, as I mentioned earlier, we're still in the process of further developing and reviewing the module. We have developed a few guiding questions for this, which you can see on your screen, that would help us assess if there are any important points that should be emphasized or clarified within the guide, whether we omitted any major issues that should be reflected in the guide, if there are factual inaccuracies or contradictions that you can see from your experience. And also, if you have any resources of examples that you could share, this is something that we will be very happy to analyze and to include in the guide, as the examples are usually very telling of what is possible, even in very challenging circumstances. So today marks the launch of the consultation on the module. We will share a link in the chat, and we will send an email to today's attendees to share the link following this meeting. You are therefore invited to review the module and make comments, and of course to raise additional questions. So thank you very, very much. In the last slide, you can see the links to access more information on the module, and of course, once again, to thank all of our partners in making possible this effort, beginning with the Norwegian Teacher Training Initiative and the support from NORWED. So thank you very much, and I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you very much, Carlos, for the presentation, which really gives us a thorough example of many of the challenges for teacher management and crises, and does put forward concrete strategies for overcoming these strategies. So these challenges. without further ado, we're going to jump right into our panel discussion to hear more about these issues from the firsthand experiences of our panelists. So I'm going to start with a question that's quite broad for Ms. Alezuyo. I would like to hear from you, Ms. Alezuyo, please. Which of the aspects of teacher management, teacher recruitment, teacher deployment, working conditions and well-being have been the most seriously impacted by the displacement crisis in Uganda? Over to you, Ms. Alezuyo.
Thank you, and good day, colleagues. I will begin by just quickly giving a brief of the teacher situation in Uganda. You find in Uganda, we have teachers that are under the government payroll, but then also teachers that are under payroll by partners and UNHCR because of the emergency. And if I look at the most impactful issues, we had issues regarding recruitment. Recruitment, not in the sense of looking for teachers who are qualified, because I think over 90% of the teachers also are qualified. But then we had the settings of the displaced persons are in very remote places, the access to those places and also the conditions they're away from the regular, settings of communities or villages. So we had issues regarding how, when you recruit a teacher who's qualified and willing to come, where do they stay? And how do they access the schools? So I think access was a very, very important aspect of that. And then secondly, when we also look at the kind of contracts that we provide in the emergency setting, the government usually provides a contract for teachers, and it's pensionable, almost permanent, also unless the teacher wishes to to retire. But then within the crisis setting, when we had the programs under the humanitarian actors, you'd find a 1-year contract, a 6-month contract, a 3-month contract. And as a result, you get the teacher, you train them, in crisis sensitive teaching methodologies, and then they get to begin to teach. And after 1 year, again, at the end of the year, they'll have to wait for a new contract. And as a result, sometimes you'd find attrition happening, either going to an opening in another government school or so, or it might be another partner that is coming up with a more attractive package. And then we also had issues related to where do they stay when they come. There is no place for them to hire there. It's in the community. State of emergency. If I quickly reflect on 2016, for example, when we had the 2016 South Sudanese influx into the country, they had to find, where do you put the teachers? They're willing to teach, they're trained, they are oriented. Where do they stay? The issues of teacher accommodation also was a very, very big one. Thankfully, I think UNHCR was also able to provide tented structures to start with, and then following that, also to be able to find the more permanent accommodation for teachers. But I must say that is still an issue that is still pending, because as the numbers grow, as we are now coming down from the emergency ratios of 150 children in a class to trying to bring it down to 120, or not 120, 80 or 60, you need more teachers. So where do you put them? How do you help them get there? And also they have families as well. If you bring, how are they staying? How are they living? And are they in touch with their families, especially since they're moving from one location to another? Then of course, related to that, also issues of language, because the language of instruction may vary from what is in country, and usually the system that is used in Uganda. So and retention during the crisis setting. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Ms. Alezuyo, for a really salient example of some of the challenges that teachers are confronted with, ranging from recruitment, accommodation, contractual arrangements, and the like. Thank you very, very much. I'm going to turn to our colleague from Burkina Faso, Ms. Angeline Neyadumba. Pour cela, I'm going to switch into French for this. Madame Neyadumba.
Ms. Neyadumba, please. I will ask the same question that I asked to Ms. Alezuyo. What aspects of teacher management, teacher recruitment, deployment, working conditions, and well-being have been impacted by crises in your country, insecurity and displacement in Burkina Faso? Ms. Neyadumba, over to you. Thank you to NORAD and to the organizers of this webinar for inviting Burkina Faso to this activity. And we are happy to share our experience with you when it comes to teacher management in a crisis setting. Burkina Faso is facing a security crisis. It has been since 2015. And we have experienced major population displacement. We have more than 1,400,000 people who have internally displaced, and we are also facing the COVID-19 crisis. And because of the security crisis, 2,440 schools were closed, and thousands of teachers were affected. And so we have to organize teacher management, and we're facing two issues. First, there is the question of areas that were abandoned, where teachers have fled their region. And the second issue has to do with the situation of villages where internally displaced people come. And for the second issue, we have to redeploy teachers. So teachers who have fled a region are redeployed so that we can meet the needs of schools in area hosting internally displaced people. There we have classrooms with too many pupils. And I'd like to say that in areas where people have fled for 1 year, 2 years because of the crisis, it is impossible to deploy new teachers in these areas. There are community initiatives, however, in these areas. And among these initiatives, some communities have hired teachers who have teaching skills because they were trained as teachers, and this has made it possible to reopen schools. And within this framework, 53 community teachers worked with us to improve the situation in the areas most affected by the crisis.
For the current school year, we know that we will have to use this type of person as staff. Now, when you have schools closed, if you see there are some 12,000 teachers affected, about half stay in their own areas when they still have schools operating, but about a quarter are then deployed or elsewhere in the country. As for the working conditions, you have to realize that when you have a crisis, when a school has been attacked, then the teachers leave that area. But whether the teachers are still teaching or not, whether they stay in their area or if they go off to safer areas, they are still paid and they still get their proper compensation as teachers. They do not have their pay suspended. And we wait until we can then redeploy the teachers to teach them. As for the social conditions and well-being, we have to make sure that there is proper support for those who have been directly affected by violence. They are put in touch with psychologists, and we have health and crisis management services too. And the government has passed legislation for public servants to get compensation when they have suffered in such conditions, and teachers are entitled to that. And there is support from the ministry at the moment from all victims of terrorist attacks. And we have 17 minor children of teachers who have died in the crisis situation, and 40 people who have had physical damage, and a couple of hundred who have suffered damage to their belongings. That's about what I can say for the current situation there. Thank you very much, Angeline, for describing the difficulties which the teachers are up against in Burkina Faso. and we saw the response by the Ministry of Education with the salaries still paid and the psychological and social support for the people. Thank you very much.
To get a teacher's perspective on how her working conditions have changed. So Ms. Stella, could you please let us know, tell us how your working conditions have changed? Maybe it's in terms of pupil-teacher ratios, salaries, or school closures. How have these conditions changed during the crisis? And what attempts were made by the teachers themselves, school leaders, or the Ministry of Education to kind of compensate for these changes in working conditions? Over to you, please, Mr. Ray. Let's see, Stella, Mr. Ray, are you there?
Yes, I'm there.
Excellent. We can hear you very well. If you'd like to turn your video on, you're welcome to, but if not, no problem. Great. Over to you.
Okay. Good afternoon to you. I welcome you all to this webinar. In Uganda, owing to the extended lockdown, many schools could not afford the maintaining of school structures and utilities, and this has led to the closure of very many private schools, and paying teachers has not been easy for most. And paying teachers has not been easy for most private schools, and this has led to very many schools lose their good teachers. However, in refugee settlement schools, all the teachers have been in position to receive all their salaries as stipulated in their contracts. However, it is a yearly contract, and also due to the new COVID-19 SOPs that demand for one teacher to a maximum of 20 learners, it makes it difficult for settlement schools which have a high enrollment to meet the standard operating procedures issued out by the Ministry of Health in Uganda, and calls for a need of more classes in order for schools to reopen. Other attempts that teachers have really made, and school leaders, in addition to the Ministry of Education, to compensate for the change in the working conditions. So far, so good. We as teachers, we've not made a very great job towards that due to limited funding. However, our funding organization, Window International Uganda, in partnership with UNHCR, has initiated a double shift system for schools to reopen, since we have a high enrollment of learners. And we've also tried to promote e-learning using the tablets that were issued to schools that have a cold drill program. And this has also eased the teaching process and also increased the coverage of the syllabus. We've also promoted the group learning in communities. In addition, our Ministry of Education and Sports has provided home learning materials that have been issued to the community, and the learners have been in position to use them and have at least acquired a lot. Then in pupil-teacher ratio, it has been a challenge to us because the enrollment, it is too big compared to the number of teachers on the station. But we've tried our level best to put all those learners in groups so that we can really deliver our content. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Mr. Hay. Very, very clear description of some of the challenges that have literally changed the way that you worked, including high enrollment the challenges to meet the COVID restrictions when confronted with this high enrollment, and some of the responses made by teachers themselves and the ministry as well, provision of materials and learning programs that helps ease the teaching and makes it easier for you. Thank you very much for your input. I'm going to switch to French now. Nous allons parler maintenant avec Grace, qui est une enseignante.
Now we're going to talk with Grace, who is an internally displaced teacher from Burkina Faso. And I would like to ask you the same question which I've just asked Mr. Latourie. How have your working conditions changed? How did they change during the crisis? And what was the reaction of the teachers, the school directors, and the ministry to cope with these changed conditions? We would like to hear your opinion, Grace. Thank you, Madam, and thank you for the opportunity for speaking. Now, when the schools were changed, we had schools closed in the region, but people still received their wages. There was no change to the payment, and the social cover was the same. We had support from humanitarian NGOs. And when we resumed classes, I saw that there were more schools and more school students at the school. There were more refugees. Thank you very much, Grace. It's very interesting to hear your opinion. We can see that you've had a real problem with the security crisis there, and you had more and more classes with mixed groups of students. You had the host community and the refugee children together. Now we're going to be talking about teacher training and initial and continuing training in crisis situation. And I would like to ask once again Ms. Ndea Dombwa from the Ministry of Education in Burkina Faso to speak on this. We would like to know what your ministry has done to maintain professional training of teachers in the crisis situation, and could you give us an idea of some form of professional development which has been implemented in Burkina Faso, and what has worked well and what proved to be more difficult? So you have the floor, Ms. Ndea Dombwa. Thank you, Leonora. Now, if you'll allow me, I would just like to add a comment to the first question. Now, in Burkina Faso, we have refugee camps. And in the refugee camps, we have Burkinabe teachers with support from the local community teachers who are from Mali. Now, I'll go into your next question. For professional development of teachers in Burkina Faso, we have a range of activities to strengthen their skills as teachers. And that work is done together with partners in the education cluster and all the partners that work with the ministry in managing the security crisis in Burkina Faso and also the health crisis in the country. In this bundle of activities which we have to realize that after terrorist attacks, there have been major impacts in school settings, and that's for both teachers and students. And so we have a training process for what we call a safe school. This is a safe school process for teachers so that they can analyze their environment and they can prepare for plans if a situation arises where they need to react in a crisis. And of course, we do have this huge challenge of security at the moment. But then there are other parts of the country where there is continuous training, and all teachers are being given this as part of the initial training of teachers. We also have a module for psychosocial support in stress situations. And this is what we've learned from difficulties experienced in the field. And this was mentioned by the colleague in Uganda. When you have a crisis situation, you really need to deal with the physical and emotional impact of the crises. And so we have psychosocial support module in Burkina Faso, and we use that to train teachers to strengthen their capacities for themselves and also so that they can provide support for the students they are teaching. The package of activities also includes educational approaches, and we've seen this in certain areas, and we've seen that there are more and more students in some areas, and we have to teach teachers how to deal with large class numbers, and they have to deal with students who often turn up in very difficult situations and who have suffered serious effects. We always work with colleagues, members, and partners who provide us with support on outreach and the declaration on safety and security in schools. And this is a statement that is very important. It's a formal declaration, and everybody should know it. And we need to have the community responding to that and dealing with that. Now, I could give you an example of a success story we've had with capacity building for teachers in the crisis situation in Burkina Faso, and I would say that it's our experience with psychosocial support. Our education cluster has supported us. We have devised our module, and the module is now available and is the basis for training teachers. And there's been a clear statement of the need for this, and we certainly see this with internally displaced communities because they're huge numbers, and obviously you have internally displaced children and students who have to be given a place in school. We're trying to strengthen this module and doing that in partnership with the Norwegian Refugee Agency. They have a special learning program which we found was very interesting in dealing with stress in classroom situations, and we're working on that so that we can expand our module on that. Now, what are the challenges? Our challenge is to succeed in building up our psychosocial module so that we can strengthen the capacities of teachers to deal with these situations. And in addition, there's a need to train teachers on remote teaching, because with COVID-19 in Burkina Faso, we devised a lot of digital teaching resources, and we set up a platform, and we share this with students working on the basis of support which is available. And so that students can use these modules properly, we need to have proper training modules for teachers so that they know how to conduct remote teaching and also monitor students doing remote learning. Because we need to make sure that the students really have done this via computers, radio, television, whatever, and we want to make sure that all the technology has been used properly. And we have to make sure that the teachers are teaching and the students are actually learning. So we have to rally all the resources available and have proper monitoring and assessment of all these programs. And in conclusion, I would like to say that for Burkina Faso, we're currently working on how we can operationalize the triple nexus we have with development, humanitarian work, and peace. And this is our optical approach for having a targeted approach. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ms. Neadomba. Thank you for sharing your experience in Burkina Faso in your capacity building with teachers. And this seems to be very effective for psychosocial support, for educational approaches, for protecting schools and teachers and students. And this also seems to be in line with the triple nexus, as you say. Thank you very much. Now I would like to turn to Grace again as a teacher. We won't put the video there to protect your confidentiality. We'd like to know what experience you've had with professional development. Since you've been working with displaced students, have you had opportunities to have additional training? And if so, what worked well? And are there other areas where you think you need to have teaching support so that you can provide better support for learners? I would like to give you the floor, Grace. Thank you for your question. No, I was lucky enough to have training, and we saw how we can train students to respond in the event of a terrorist attack. We explain what they can do at school to avoid danger, and this helps both students and teachers organize themselves and respond if there's an attack at the school. We can have a careful evacuation plan, rescue plan, and so on. And of course, we're dealing with students who are often traumatized, and they need to have faith in us. We have a lot of displaced students, and they often have difficulty concentrating at school. They're scared, they're aggressive, they fight amongst one another, and there's a real problem with discipline. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace. It was extremely interesting to listen to what you said and to see the needs you had and the training courses you had access to. It's interesting to see that you had access to training that was given to both teachers and learners. Together, you were able to think about how you could respond if sadly there was a problem in the school. So thank you so much for sharing your experience with us, Grace.
We're going to hear a bit more about information sharing and consultation mechanisms. And for that, we'll turn to our colleagues from Uganda. And Ms. Alezuyo, pardon, we'd like to hear a little bit more about how teachers are consulted. So what consultation mechanisms did your ministry put in place to consult with and to share information with teachers in your experience? And are there, other opportunities for teachers to engage in decision-making processes? So over to you. Miss Alezuyo, are you able to hear us? Okay. Well, perhaps you're having some technical difficulties, so we can move ahead to another question, I think this time for Stella, which is still around the issues of communication and coordinating. So Stella, could you tell us a little bit about the role that you have played in communicating with school communities through perhaps back to school campaigns or in encouraging refugees, IDPs to attend school? Oops.
Yeah, thank you. We've set up village education committees, these connect us to.
We can hear you.
We've set up village education committees, VEX, and these connect us to learners and parents help us to coordinate several activities that take place in communities. Secondly, We've promoted community awareness through sensitization meetings for dissemination of education and other information. And also we've participated in weekly village meetings to get feedback on different interventions. Not only that, we've also formed different clubs, for example, debating clubs that has boosted learners' self-esteem and confidence. We've also promoted charity work, both within and outside school, to convey vital information to the community regarding education acquisition by learners, not forgetting girl-child empowerment and motivation through public talks and provision with basic necessities like sanitary packages that involves sanitary pads and knickers. In promotion of home learning, we engage the community and school structures to ensure that no learner is left behind. And in partnership with protection partners, we offered guidance and counseling to refugees, for example, in the dangers of early marriages and teenager pregnancy, plus also the risks of acquisition of sexually transmitted diseases. And the partnering organization, UNHCR and Window International Uganda, it has provided learners with solar-powered radios, which has also eased the communication in the communities. But while executing our roles, we've encountered several challenges. For example, the students with special needs, for example, those with hearing impairment, the deaf, the blind and the lame have not been catered for in our education sector, in refugee settlement schools, and also few computers and tablets were issued out to schools. And that has also really affected us in our works. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Stella, for that thorough response. It's very, very interesting to hear about the level of engagement that you do have and that you maintain with the community, follow up with students, domestic house calls almost, community awareness campaigns, and even working to overcome some of the challenges with supporting connectivity through radios and the like. And thank you also for mentioning some of the persistent challenges, particularly around accessibility for special needs students. Thank you very, very much for that. Perhaps we can try to go back to the last question for Ms. Alezuyo, also around consultation mechanisms. Connie, are you able to speak? Yes.
Yes, I'm now able to speak. Thank you.
Excellent. Great. Let me please just re-ask the question. The question is around the consultation mechanisms that your ministry put in place to share information with teachers, but also to consult with teachers during the crises, and what kind of opportunities exist for teachers to engage in decision-making processes. So over to you, Connie.
Thank you once again. When we look at the information sharing, both mechanisms and channels, there are levels. First of all, there is the teacher management information system that has been set in place just to be able to get an idea of where the teachers are with the kind of qualifications and their duration in service and all that. And then usually we have the district education officers. They're in charge of education in the districts at the local governments, but then they have an association as well. So usually when there is information, this is quickly used to be able to reach to the communities where the teachers are. And then also we have the head teachers as well. They also have an association, head teachers association at primary level, at secondary level, for government schools, at primaries, at private schools as well. So through this, when there is information, they are reached with the information, but then they also get the feedback for the teachers to interact. And then more specifically at the school level, we then have WhatsApp groups, especially with the COVID-19 lockdown when schools were closed and teachers were away. We needed to have teachers available, trained for radio learning, teachers available to support with the psychosocial events or with the home learning sessions, and children who are not able to have support, through an available radio. The WhatsApp groups on phones were very, very helpful. And to date, we still have those available, and they help to be able to both mobilize, to share information, to get feedback. And sometimes it is a lot. When we had the phase school reopening, for example, and then we are trying to track and do surveillance on when there are cases of COVID-19 in the schools, again, that the WhatsApps were used very quickly to be able to send an alert message and then to be able to receive a response, or even a brief training or guidance on what do you do, how do you, handle the isolation procedures, how do you make sure you check with the contacts. So I think those are very helpful. Additionally, we also have radios as well. Stella just mentioned the radios that they use for the home learning packs, but then the radios are also used to be able to reach out. And I must mention that you find that because of sometimes we have access issues because not every person who's available, not every teacher or every school is within, within the connectivity area. So while some can be able to access the WhatsApp messages, you still need to be able to find a way of reaching a teacher in their locality. And then secondly, because of the extended school closure, you find that teachers are not in the locality of the school. Some of them have gone back to their homes where they are from, and then it's getting to them sometimes may not be as quick and as efficient. But for the bulk who have been able to stay within the school areas or who have access, those are able to be reached. And then additionally, we also have the Uganda Association or National Association of Teachers Union. And again, teachers are encouraged to register onto this platform again. And then that is used as a way of reaching the teachers because they have branches at national level, but they also have branches at district level. And these are also used as well, both to disseminate, to mobilize, but also to get feedback on what is happening and what the issues are, and also to be able to share the position of, ongoing, sometimes there's messages to be able to share. Sometimes there's opportunity for training in terms of a new curriculum or a new way of being able to, just prepare. So these are some of the mechanisms and channels that are used by government and also the partners as well. And so I don't want to repeat what Stella has mentioned, but she did mention a very important aspect, the village education committees, because on these committees, you have parents who sit on these committees as well. And then you have the referral mechanism. So you find these, especially within the settlements, these are very, very important for being able to get to the teachers where they are, but also the learners where they are, and then to be able to quickly get the information through. And every teacher also is linked up with, at the school level, they're also linked up through a mechanism to their head teachers as well. And as I mentioned earlier, issues of access notwithstanding, because definitely there are those who are able to access, but there are those who may have the device, but because of the connectivity, the network, I mentioned about areas being not very accessible sometimes because of internet connectivity or the network access, even if it's a phone call. Some have had to travel up to 15 kilometers, or you have somebody traveling quite a distance to be able to reach a teacher with information. Also, they can be able to also participate in an activity if it's a training, or currently we're doing vaccination of teachers to support the return to schools. So in that kind of scenario, so you find other means are used to be able to make sure that they can be reached as much as possible. So.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much, Ms. Alezuyo. I think it's interesting how you mentioned at one point that COVID, was an opportunity in a way and a test of communication mechanisms and consultation. And I think that's true in many contexts. It's interesting, very interesting to hear about the formal mechanisms of consultation through the Uganda National Teacher Union, the head teacher associations, and then all the way down to the village education communities and their essential role in engaging with parents as well, and providing that link between teachers and parents. And then of course the informal consultation mechanisms and communication mechanism of WhatsApp, for example. Very, very interesting. Thank you very much. So with that, I see that there are many questions coming in from the chat. So I'm going to turn over. I would like to first thank all of the panelists very much for all of your input and thoughtful reflections, which were really inspiring and gave us a lot to think about and discuss, and have generated quite a few questions from the chat. So I'm going to turn over to my colleague Charlotte Birkin from UNHCR to moderate the discussion from the chat. Over to you, Charlotte.
Thank you, Leonora. And thanks again to all the panelists for this fascinating discussion. A lot of questions in the chat indeed, so we will try to select some of them from the audience, which I will ask the panelists to answer. Let's start maybe with a question for the teachers, and I will maybe ask Stella if she agrees to take on this first question. What about the role of parents and communities to overcome the challenges that you've talked about? So Stella, if you can hear me, can you say a few words on the role of parents and communities to overcome all the challenges that you have mentioned?
Yeah, thank you. Parents have really done a very great job in overcoming the new challenges that the education sector has encountered through encouraging their students, their learners to do their homework, to use the home learning materials distributed to them. They have really created for them adequate time, because through the visits we carried out several home visits, and the response from the parents and the learners would be that really the parents have given them adequate time to read while at home, and they've also utilized the radios and any other resource at home to do the reading from home. So sincerely speaking, parents have created an ample space, conducive environment to have education conducted from home. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Stella. Yes, received. Thanks a lot, Stella. I'll now switch to French. Donc, une deuxième question à laquelle...
A second question, and I'd like to give the floor to Grace, if she can answer this question. Grace, you have talked about psychosocial training. Could you give us some information about the feedback you got from learners, from children, when it comes to the impact of the crisis on their learning? And could you share a few examples when it comes to the impact of this psychosocial training on teachers and as a result on learners? Grace, can you hear me? So, could you give us some information about the feedback you had from learners? How do learners see the impact of the crisis on their own learning? This is the first part of my question. And also, could you tell us more about the impact of the psychosocial training you had access to on teachers and as a result on learners? Could you tell us more about this? Learners are struggling to focus when they're in the classroom. They're becoming aggressive, they're fighting, some of them are scared. There is a great deal of discrimination. So I'm following a training course called APS. Grace, could you tell us how this training course helped you in your classroom as a teacher? So this training course helped me give more courage to learners so they could actually learn, so they could try to be less aggressive, to become role models for other students in the classroom. Thank you so much, Grace. Another question that is linked to training, but here we'd like to talk about initial training. Angeline, could you tell us if the lessons learned from the current crisis are actually taken into account in teacher initial training? And when it comes to continuing education for teachers, is everything taken into account to update teacher training to include crisis management in the initial training of teachers? Angeline, you have the floor. Thank you. So when it comes to initial training, the integration of new content in the curriculum for teachers is a long process. And as a result, currently, given that we have started our current training course in 2017, well, everything is integrated in the continuing training of teachers in Burkina Faso. So this is part of teacher training as soon as they enter teaching school. But there are also modules that we use to build capacity within the teaching body. This is this mostly has to do with pedagogical issues, class management when there are students that are struggling, gender-sensitive teaching. All these themes are taken into account into initial training of teachers, but we have already made modifications so that we can build capacity of teachers who are in a difficult situation, who have classes, who have students who are in difficult areas with a lot of displaced learners. For psychosocial support, this is a new theme for us, as I said earlier, and our module is being built, but from what we hear from the field, and given the crisis that is ongoing in our country, we think it is necessary to start a process to see how this module could already be given to teachers for initial training. But this is something we're thinking about currently with the technical services in charge of teacher training. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angeline.
Another question for you, if you can hear us, Connie. Yes, great. So a question on recruitment for you. So to address access, can it be possible to recruit the teachers locally to the emergency context or from within? So is it possible to have some kind of alternative teacher recruitment modalities from the emergency context itself to address access difficulties? Over to you, Connie.
Thank you. Very quickly, I think it is possible, but not to the scale required, because when we see the location of where the emergency, the children are or the schools are, it is not in highly populated places. These are very remote, sparsely populated districts or areas. And as a result, you cannot get enough teachers. And usually when the recruitment is done, we also do get some teachers from the refugee community, although now they meet a challenge of being able to meet the requirements for recruitment and recruitment as teachers because of the varying certification models and the lack of arrangements, inter-country arrangements, say with either South Sudan or DRC, where the teachers would seamlessly just come and present their papers and then they get accommodated within the system. So for that, we usually have a step provision where they come in as assistant teachers to be able to support, especially in areas of language, but also to support within the context setting as well. But for just recruiting teachers locally, the numbers locally would not be sufficient. And the other challenge we note is that you find there might be teachers, but then if you're looking at a language like English, you'd find, and in secondary school, you'd find there are very few teachers available for that. Or for some of the subjects, you'd find that you'd have to recruit from beyond the area where the need is. So those kind of present challenges and limitations on how much you can recruit, because I agree, it definitely would work if you can just recruit locally, so you don't have to go through the challenges of where will you stay, how will you access your family. That would be the best. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Connie. And thank you again to all the panelists for sharing their experiences with us today. I will now hand over to Mr. Carlos Vargas Tamez for the closing remarks. Maybe just to mention, Carlos, that we also received a couple of questions on the module and on the consultation process. And some of the questions were about to know if the module will cover questions such as private education, contract teachers, and especially the role of parents and the community, and also on how the consultation will involve teachers. So if you might want to answer some of these questions with your closing remarks. Thanks a lot. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Charlotte. And thank you very much to all the panelists and participants for this very rich discussion. I have noted some of the questions that have been raised that I will not reiterate in the interest of time, and also because the examples of Uganda and of Burkina Faso have shown us the multiple challenges, but also some policy responses and some practices that have been put in place to ensure learning continuity. Maybe just a word on the two issues. I mean, there were many questions and we don't have much time, but just to say that the two issues that were mentioned, particularly around the participation of parents and communities. Ms. Alesuyo has already mentioned these parent and teacher communities that have been forged, for example. But just to say that it is definitely one of the elements that will be addressed in the guides. We see the importance of teachers, particularly in crisis situations, as community builders. The connection, and I think in COVID, we also saw how the connection between teachers and their learners, but also their families and their communities has been fundamental in adapting practices to the specific needs that the communities face and to the changes that need to be made in terms of calendars, in terms of formats, and so on. And just to say one word on the issue of private education, this is certainly one of the most complex problems and one of the most complex issues. We have realized how in times of crisis and disruption, for example, the working conditions, the salaries of private education teachers are the ones to first suffer and stop and suffer also from contractual conditions, from the redundance and so on. So I think in this respect, and I will not speak more of that, but within the just to share with you that within the let's say the unpacking of the elements of the teacher policy development guide, this module deals particularly with education in emergencies, but there's a module also that is being developed on the financing of teacher policies. And this, of course, includes provisions as to how to plan ahead for the non-interruption and the contractual continuity of teachers both in the public and in the private sector. Of course, in crisis situations, the issue of volunteer teachers, community teachers, how we validate their experience, how we recognize, and how we actually certify, for example, experience that has been gained in informal settings, in non-formal education, is also something important, but which might not be part of this guide, but as I said, of further efforts we're doing in developing and unpacking the many dimensions, the 9 of them, that you see in the teacher policy development guide. So just let me just stop there to thank again all of our participants, to thank Leonora for the excellent moderation, and Charlotte as well, to thank Gertane for the introduction, and then Tiago, of course, for the continuing support of the project. This is one of the many results of the collaboration of the different partners. So a word of appreciation, thanks, and gratitude to them all as well. As we announced, the module is being co-developed as part of the NTI initiative in close partnership with the IIEP. Following this meeting, we will be making the draft public and inviting comments, suggestions, and case studies. Many of the comments that were typed in the chat can probably be elaborated into further input that you can share by the 1st of October, which is our working deadline. So after this, the final module will be published as part of the teacher policy development guide, and we hope that it will make a helpful addition to the way systems can respond to support teachers and learners in all crises and emergencies. Thank you so very much for your active participation, for your interest in the topic, and in advance for your inputs to finalize this module. Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all. Goodbye.